I'm Dr. Jim Coyle, and this is the sixth tutorial in social work practice with individuals. We're going to be talking about narrative therapy in this tutorial, which is very different from the other models we're talking about in this course because the worker uses themselves in quite a different way, and the focus is on the stories that influence the client's perceptions about what's going on more than directly on the presenting problem. So it's quite a different way of conceptualizing what's going on. So let's get to it and talk about that. Like solution-focused therapy, narrative therapy is also based upon postmodern theory, but specifically it's based on social constructionism, which proposes that a person within their environment constructs the reality, their way of seeing the world. So definitions of reality may be very different since people and environments are unique. And the way that people see their world is going to influence the reality that they see about the event that they are coming in to talk about. So to begin with, as I've asked you in the past, consider what you've already learned about this. What do you know from your past learning, from your observations of people, your work with clients, from the current reading that you've done? Ask yourself, as you're putting all of this together, what makes sense to you, what seems to work, what you have some uncertainty about, or what you have some questions about, and jot those down so we can talk about them during the in-class discussion. Important narrative therapy concepts include the beliefs in social context influence how we interpret events, and that talking about problems identifies discourses or narratives or stories that suggest meaning, and that personal narratives or discourses are influenced by culture and environment. So this is a model that very definitely is not only about the person, but about the influence of their environment, their community, their culture, their belief systems that come in a community rather than just specifically their internal beliefs and schemas, which is what cognitive therapy would focus on. This is, as I said earlier about solution focus, is broader than that. Narrative therapy concepts were proposed by Michael White and David Epstein, who are both social workers, Michael White from Australia and David Epstein from New Zealand. And they proposed a kind of a different type of therapy that really took into consideration the person's environment. Michael White said that the person is not the problem is the problem. And so one of the things that this whole perception takes a look at is that rather than focusing on the person somehow not having what they need to do to get better, it's that the problem sort of comes in and takes over, and how do you resolve that in some way? So it is a matter of reauthoring stories, of coming up with other types of stories which are going to work better. When you use narrative therapy to help clients, you want to assess what they initially call the problem-saturated story that's influenced by past personal, familial, and social stories. So you ask the person about their presenting problem, but you're also interested in what is kind of their thinking, what is the explanations for why this is a problem. So, and then the goal becomes from that assessment is to move away from that narrative, that discourse that defines the problem, and identify a discourse which is going to work towards being in a more adaptive. So similar to solution-focused therapy, it's towards a more hopeful future. So narrative therapy methods include asking curious questions. And I think that I like that word curious, which is why I put it in there, because they are focused on finding out what the narrative is, what they're kind of mapping the belief systems, the schemas, whatever words you want to use in terms of those stories, but they're curious. They're not questions that are judgmental. They're not questions that are strategic or attempt to get the client to have some insight. They're just to help the client kind of take a look at the context for where their problem sits. And for that reason, it's similar to the person-centered model that we talked about before, in terms of it's very supportive and very, kind of really interested in how the person kind of explores and sees their own world. And for that reason, it is kind of a slower method than some of the other more active methods, where there's the worker is trying to suggest very specific things fairly early on. So once the client begins to identify problem-saturated stories, then the treatment focuses on labeling that story somehow, and then what's called externalizing the problem. So in the textbook, they talk about Martin and about how Martin came in for help for his temper, and he got very angry and was, and the discussion with him really kind of showed how important he felt that being a strong male, that being, in control of showing that he's in charge and everything was a very important thing to him. And so when in all his interactions, he was easily frustrated if people seemed to be coming on and questioning his own, kind of control or his own strengths. And so one of the things is as you begin to see that as a problem-saturated story, the goal is to separate that from the person, because the problem is the problem, not the person being the problem. So that's externalizing. It is labeling and then talking about the problem as, kind of anthropomorphizing it as if it's a separate entity. So in this case, you would help Martin identify, okay, so when you are looking at how would you label this? Would you label it as angry? Would you label it as this He-Man, this be in charge type of thing? You help him identify a label that's going to fit for him. So let's say for a moment that he identifies He-Man as kind of something that has meaning for him in terms of labeling this. So externalizing the problem is then talking about He-Man. So what happens when He-Man comes in and takes over? What do you see happening? What does He-Man do to control your behavior, to do what you're doing? So the thing is that he sees this as being separate from himself. And then you begin to reflect and normalize, okay, this is how it's happening. This is what's going on. You've got this problem-saturated story. And in order to help the client reauthorize alternative stories, it's a matter of them finding the story. Again, it's not about the worker trying to find a story that's going to fit for the client. It's about the client identifying that, and you use the same process to identify that story as you used to identify the problem-saturated story. You talk about asking curious questions. What has happened in your life that didn't fit that? What has happened, when He-Man isn't around? What are some other stories that explain what is happening then? And when did that happen in your life? And part of the thing is identifying times in the past where there's a different type of story going on. So for example, if Martin was able to identify that his grandfather was a very strong male, but never raised his voice. So then the curious question is, well, how do you know the grandfather was strong? And how did grandfather show that strength? And what is it that you notice about that? And how, and the thing is then it becomes identifying a possible story that a client like Martin could use to have an alternative way of interpreting what's going on, so that there may be things that never having to raise your voice doesn't mean that you let other people control, but it may mean that there's another aspect to that. And Martin can learn from that and perhaps use that to help him change that problem-saturated story. Finally, narrative therapy often uses kind of ceremonies and celebrations. They will kind of identify, okay, ways of, what do you do to get rid of this He-Man story? How do you celebrate the fact that you've got a different story? How do you tell people about this? How do you feel good about it yourself? And so they identify rituals that can be used in order to accomplish this. This is kind of similar to that reinforcing praise that we saw in behavioral, but this is kind of something that comes from the client rather than from the worker. It's suggesting, how would the client celebrate? How would the client kind of, in the client's context, what is celebration? What is ritual? What are the ceremonies that they can use that make sense to them? There's a very interesting client in this role play that I am recommending for you, Elon, Native American. And I think that some very interesting ways that the therapist is trying to help him identify what's going on in his life. So I'd like you to watch it and ask yourself, as you are watching it, how does the worker externalize the problem and identify unique outcomes? Unique outcomes are similar to what we talked about in terms of exceptions in the solution-focused model. Acknowledge the language that the client uses, as well as go through a process of engagement, collecting information, assessing, setting goals, and intervention. Although, again, this is going to be done in a slightly different way because the focus of the therapy is on the story. It is on the client's view of the world rather than specifically about what do I do about this specific presenting problem. And so it can take the worker away from the presenting problem, take the client away from the presenting problem, and ultimately the presenting problem is represented by the problem-saturated story, which then gets externalized. So there's an element there where that separation process comes, and that is, kind of helping the client acknowledge that, client discover it instead of the therapist discovering it, and the goal becomes to separate it and then be able to author a different story that's going to be more adaptable. There's a handout that I put on Blackboard about the narrative therapy process that I got online, and I think that could give you an idea of some of the kind of the processes. It's a very different way of conceptualizing what happens in a counseling session, as well as there's an interesting case with a hospice client in the textbook, Mrs. Kelly. And that's a good example because narrative therapy often fits very well when you're dealing with people who are elderly or terminally ill, because it really kind of helps them focus on that process. And it's a developmental process of looking at what's happened in my life and then being able to acknowledge, where I go and how I can feel okay about where I've been in my life. The benefits of narrative therapy is it supports a client's cultural heritage because that's part of how those stories are made. And so it can fit very well with the social justice and the kind of oppressed issues that social workers often deal with. It focuses on the client's personal creativity and sense of meaning, and it focuses on client strengths. Narrative therapy, on the other hand, has been critiqued because it doesn't address immediate needs. And if there are immediate needs, you'll probably need to use some crisis intervention or some other type of intervention, maybe just some linking with resources or whatever that social workers do. in order to address this, because narrative therapy takes some time. It's a slower, more reflective type of model. It may be difficult for the social worker to be neutral and to focus on the client's life story and worldview, rather than doing something right away about that presenting problem. Because a lot of times we are in our own mind, we have to do something about that right away, and that becomes secondary in this model. And it tends to involve longer term treatment, and sometimes that doesn't fit with either administrative requirements or insurance requirements that want this presenting problem addressed more quickly. Now, before I kind of end this, I wanted to mention a little bit about how talking about all these models helps us in terms of the assignments. So consider what you've learned in the past few tutorials about cognitive behavioral therapy, solution-focused and narrative therapy, and compare that to what you learned about the models and last week, person-centered and psychodynamic models. And you're getting a sense that there's different ways of kind of addressing the problems that our clients bring for us. So for the analysis paper, you're either going to analyze a problem or challenge of interest to you and choose something that you either work on now or you're interested in learning more about. And what treatment model, whether it's from this course or other models, best resolves that problem. That's kind of the goal. And you're going to be doing that a lot in practice, because one of the things, and when someone comes in and they have something new that they're thinking about and everything, you say, gee, what's the best thing for me to do with them? Then you do a little bit of research and you find, okay, what's been written about it? What's the research say is the best thing to do that's going to be most helpful to them? The second option for the analysis paper is to analyze how different models, those discussed in this course, but perhaps other ones too, may use common practice aspects. Because we're all doing a number of different things. We are having a relationship with the client. We are conceptualizing how client thinking and behavior and feelings are all interrelated. We are talking about the role of the therapist, the role of the social worker and how they do that. We may be talking about a balance between what's going on internally and what's going on in their environment. These are all aspects that social workers use. How does it compare across the different models? So the thing is that's another way that you can begin to ask yourself, what am I going to write about? And how will this kind of help me understand different ways to use those aspects? So again, you choose an aspect that is very interesting to you. Finally, for the role play interview, you're going to ask yourself, well, which model that we've talked about tends to fit for the way that I see things? So that's going to relate a little bit also to the reflective assignment that you've already done. My own beliefs about how problems occur and how change occurs, and how do the models that we're talking about fit within that? How does it fit for you? Or another way to look at it is maybe what model do you want to learn more about? And so you want to kind of do a little bit of practicing with it so that you can use that better with your own clients. So this is a way of trying to take what we're learning in these tutorials and in this class and in the reading and say they're all very helpful in terms of the assignments that you're going to be asked to do. So to end things off here, as I always end things off, consider what you've learned, the reading assignments, this tutorial from your own experiences, jot down what you're going to do, what you're learning, what you have questions about, and guess what? We're going to talk about this in class, and I look forward to that.